Aloha and welcome back to the Stick with the Winners class. My dad, Dick B., and I are providing background information and additional details concerning our new book, Stick with the Winners, How to Conduct More Effective 12-Step Recovery Meetings Using Conference-Approved Literature. And now, for this video, I'd like to have my dad talk a little bit. Dad?
Dick B. again. Ken is reading of the 16 practices of early AAs. And I wanted to interrupt the presentation of these 16 practices to point out something to those who are viewing our videos and reading our books. If there's one thing that characterizes almost all of them, that's the abundance of footnotes. Why? Because we've tried very, very hard in some 23 years of research and writing not to speculate, but rather to document when we say that this or that happened in Akron, to show you the source so that it's not our opinion, our conjecture, our speculation, or some other self-made concept. So I'll turn it back to Ken, who's going to read 9 through 16 of the old school practices.
Thanks, Dad. This is video 10, and we are covering the original Akron AA Christian Fellowship Program, which we have also called Old School AA. And it consisted of 16 practices of the early pioneers. These 16 practices are sufficiently lengthy that we present them in two parts. I already covered the first 8, and this is part 2, practices 9 to 16 of Old School AA in Akron. Practice number 9 is that the real surrender, that's what they called it, by each newcomer took place at the, quote, regular meeting on Wednesdays. At these weekly meetings, there was a time in which newcomers were required to make a, quote, real surrender, end of quote, with Dr. Bob and 1 or 2 others upstairs. There the newcomer, on his knees, accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, if he wasn't already a Christian, asked that alcohol be taken out of his life, and asked strength and guidance to live according to cardinal Christian teachings. The elders prayed with him after the manner of James chapter 5, verse 16. There are 4 known eyewitnesses to the fact that acceptance of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior was a prerequisite to admission to the Akron Christian Fellowship Program. My dad personally talked to 2 of them on the telephone, Ed Andy from Lorain, Ohio, and Larry Bauer. Clarence Snyder was the 3rd, and his evidence was attested to my dad, Dick B., by Clarence's wife, Grace Snyder, personally. That's his 3rd wife, Grace, and by Clarence's sponsee and biographer, Mitchell K. J.D. Holmes of Indiana provided the 4th piece of evidence. Practice number 10. There was extensive reading of Christian devotionals and literature provided by Dr. Bob, or recommended by Dr. Bob or his wife Ann, and or distributed or made available at meetings. Frequently, they were given copies of Henry Drummond's The Greatest Thing in the World, The Upper Room, which is a Methodist periodical, Emmett Fox's The Sermon on the Mount, James Allen, As a Man Thinketh, and The Runner's Bible. Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue Smith Windows, personally told my dad that Dr. Bob loaned to early AAs many of the books he owned, and that the early AAs read those books and circulated them widely. Practice 11. There was particular stress on study of the book of James, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew chapters 5 through 7, and 1 Corinthians 13. As to these, We provided footnotes concerning the book of James, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and 1 Corinthians 13. The 12th practice was that meetings concluded with invitations to reach out to newcomers in the hospital and elsewhere, and then closed with the Lord's Prayer. The 13th practice is that there was frequent socializing in the homes, particularly on Saturday evenings. The 14th practice is that the little group of members and wives knew each other well and were in daily contact. Quote, daily contact was emphasized, end of quote, as one source puts it. They frequently phoned one another. They frequently visited the homes of each other. They gathered for parties, dances, covered dish suppers, and picnics. They prayed together, and they frequently had meals together. Compare the practices of the first century Christians as described in Acts chapter 1, chapter 2, verses 38 to 47, chapter 3, chapter 4, verses 29 to 35, chapters 5 and 6. The 15th practice involved keeping track of names, addresses, phone numbers, and sobriety information about each member, and that was commonplace, as evidenced by their own address books and rosters. They kept little address books with the names, phone numbers, and street addresses of the pioneers. Also, this data was listed on some of the rosters which they kept, and we'll be covering that in this 16th practice. The final practice, number 16, is that there are several extant rosters naming many pioneer AAs that make it easy today to name and document the successes, relapses, returns, and failures among the original AAs. A key example is Dr. Bob's handwritten memo and roster on his own office stationery on file in the Rockefeller archives today. Other rosters listing the name and addresses, sobriety dates and relapses, if any, of early AAs were kept and still exist today. Richard Kay of Massachusetts, author of 4 major works on early AA history, including studies of the, quote, first 40, end of quote, cures, about early articles on AA, and about statistics relating to AA, had discussed these rosters in his works. Richard Kay spent several months with my dad, Dick B., and with me in Maui, reviewing the rosters and materials that my dad had. He also had, as well, materials he obtained from AA General Services in New York and from elsewhere. He carefully examined photocopies of original documents, newspaper accounts, and extant lists of the early AA members and their sobriety records. His work is the most important study of early AA successes, cures, and announcements written to date. There are also my dad's own copies of pioneer member rosters, which were acquired by my dad from several AA historians such as Earl Husband, George Trotter, Sue Smith Windows, that's Dr. Bob's daughter, and Ray Grumney, the former longtime archivist and member of the managing board at Dr. Bob's home in Akron. Their value became particularly important when other evidence was reviewed and clearly disclosed that early AAs commonly kept address books, many of which contained names, addresses, phone numbers, sobriety information, and relapse and death notations. As a group, these rosters enable an accurate evaluation of the successes of the original 40 pioneers surveyed by Bill W. and Dr. Bob in November 1937. And they provide important evidence relating to early AA's claims concerning 75 and 93% success rates. Early AA claimed a 75% success rate overall, and Cleveland, early Cleveland, had a documented 93% success rate, respectively. Recently, an anonymous friend from New Jersey supplied my dad and me with a copy of a roster in Dr. Bob's own hand that we mentioned just a few moments ago, written on his medical office stationery and listing all the successful original members, giving names, drinking history, relapses if any, sobriety dates, and their ages. It came from the Rockefeller Archives in New York, as I mentioned. We now possess one secured by us from those archives. It is a vital new piece of evidence apparently unknown to those who have spoken about this previously. And those are the 16 practices of early AA that we've documented, and that's all for this video. Thank you.